Title: Lessons from the Ancients, Pre-Modern Warfare Tactics in the World Wars. As Major William Hays gazed over the shattered landscapes of the Western Front in 1916, the thick smell of gunpowder and churned earth filled his lungs. The trench before him stretched endlessly, a bleak ribbon across France, but what troubled him most wasn't the mud or barbed wire. It was the eerie sense that, despite all the technological advances, tanks, machine guns, poison gas, he and his men were fighting a war that felt strangely ancient. Hays, a history scholar before the war, had studied the tactics of the ancient Greeks, Romans, and medieval armies. The more he thought about it, the more he recognized ancient principles echoing across the field. Leaders and generals throughout history had faced similar dilemmas of movement, defense, and deception. Now, in the modern age, the lessons of the ancients seemed once again relevant. Chapter 1: Phalanxes and Fortifications. The first lesson that came to Hays's mind was the Greek phalanx. Alexander the Great, he knew, had used tightly packed formations to create an impenetrable wall of spears that rolled over his enemies. While machine guns now rendered such compact lines suicidal, the phalanx's core idea, standing firm in tight formation to create an unbreakable barrier, was reborn in trench warfare. The British and German armies dug into their trenches, relying on a line of men to hold ground while fending off assaults. The trench lines might not have been moving forward as Alexander's phalanxes did, but the principle was the same. Hold the line, withstand the onslaught, and resist any attempt to breach the defensive barrier. Hays pondered the irony. The trenches were ancient in spirit, as if the armies had reverted to stone walls and moats of medieval fortresses. The difference was that no knight could survive the artillery blasts now shaking the earth. Chapter 2: Feigned Retreats and Tactical Deception. As the war raged, another lesson from ancient warfare emerged: the art of deception. Hays recalled how the Mongols had perfected the feigned retreat, fooling their enemies into thinking they were fleeing, only to turn and attack with ferocity. The Mongols had used this tactic to devastating effect against more rigid European armies, who were drawn out of formation and into chaos. During the Battle of the Somme, Hays witnessed a modern parallel. The Germans would sometimes stage a hasty retreat, leaving behind just enough troops to engage the advancing British forces. The British, eager to gain ground, pursued, only to be ambushed by machine guns and artillery as soon as they broke cover. The Mongols would have approved. The principle of surprise continued to evolve through World War II, where commanders across Europe crafted their own versions of these ancient feints. The Blitzkrieg, while new in its intensity and speed, carried hints of ancient rapid attacks and surprise maneuvers that generals like Hannibal and Julius Caesar had honed on ancient battlefields. Chapter 3: Psychological Warfare and the Siege. One afternoon in 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the Italian campaign, Hays, now Colonel Hays, reflected on a tactic that Julius Caesar had used: the psychological impact of a siege. The Romans would cut off supply lines, sometimes starving out their enemies instead of fighting them head-on. In the Second World War, this approach took the form of extensive bombing campaigns and blockades, most notably seen in the Battle of Stalingrad. Here, the Soviet Union took a page from Caesar's book and fortified the city, surrounding the Germans in an unbreakable siege. Though neither side could easily advance, the effect was devastating. Slowly, hunger and dwindling supplies broke the morale of the German Sixth Army. They faced a slow, crushing defeat, much like ancient armies that had been encircled by Caesar or Alexander. Hays marveled at how powerful this lesson had remained. Despite modern technology, the essence of the siege, of surrounding and suffocating an enemy into submission, was just as effective in the 20th century as it had been in ancient Rome. Chapter 4: The guerrilla spirit. In the mountains of North Africa, Hayes encountered an approach as old as warfare itself: guerrilla tactics. During the First Punic War, the Carthaginians used a small band approach, harrying the Romans with quick strikes rather than engaging in full-scale battles. The North African campaign mirrored these tactics, with smaller Allied and Axis units launching lightning-fast strikes, hiding among the sands and mountains, then disappearing. The Allies knew the value of these methods, relying on local knowledge to hit the enemy unexpectedly. The same tactics had been used by Hannibal, who had once crossed the Alps to catch the Romans by surprise. In World War II, the guerrilla approach took on a modern form with the French resistance. In the forests and villages of Nazi-occupied France, small bands of fighters attacked supply lines, assassinated officers, and sabotaged communications. It was warfare in its rawest, most ancient form, an echo of conflicts fought with slings, arrows, and sabotage. Chapter 5. A Legacy in Strategy. By the war's end, Hayes was deeply affected by the profound ways ancient and modern warfare intersected. The great wars, for all their modern machinery, still relied on strategies honed in the dust of ancient battlefields. He wondered if, perhaps, every war would always contain these echoes of the past. For Hayes, these ancient tactics had become more than lessons in warfare. They were reminders of the timelessness of strategy, human ingenuity, and the haunting cyclical nature of conflict. In the ruins of the 20th century, the lessons of the ancients had guided, influenced, and perhaps even preserved them through two of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The cost of these lessons had been high, but they would live on, waiting to resurface in the battles of the future. By the war's end, Hayes was deeply affected by the profound ways ancient and modern warfare intersected. The great wars, for all their modern machinery, still relied on strategies honed in the dust of ancient battlefields. He wondered if, perhaps, every war would always contain these echoes of the past. For Hayes, these ancient tactics had become more than lessons in warfare. They were reminders of the timelessness of strategy, human ingenuity, and the haunting cyclical nature of conflict. In the ruins of the 20th century, the lessons of the ancients had guided, influenced, and perhaps even preserved them through two of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Yet, as he sat alone one evening, scribbling his observations in a tattered journal, Hayes realized that the most enduring lesson might not be the tactics themselves, but rather the futility of repeating the past without learning from its true cost. "What good is a lesson," he wrote, "if it leads us only to repeat the mistakes of those who came before?" He thought of how civilizations rose and fell on these same principles, and he wondered what future generations would do with these grimly recycled strategies. Would they one day look back on the world wars as Hayes did the ancient conflicts, in search of lessons both to emulate and avoid? Or would they, too, become mired in a loop of technology-advanced yet soul-worn conflict? As his pen scratched across the page, Hayes hoped that somewhere, someone would break the cycle, that the lessons from these wars, ancient and modern, would one day lead not to conquest, but to peace. And perhaps, he thought with a glimmer of optimism, that understanding the past wasn't just a means of winning wars, but of preventing them. For now, though, the pages of history turned, with lessons waiting, as they always did, to be learned.